Good morning. This is the ancient Texan. I'll give you a short look at who's talking if I'm smart enough. I do it the old-fashioned way. Good morning. I want to talk a little bit about China and the trade war. I grew up in the metals industry. Got out of school, there was 100 copper smelters, 30 lead smelters. We made more copper in Arizona than the rest of the world put together. Yeah, back in the ancient days. We're now on also run. I've watched them put the magnesium business out of business in the rest of the world. Aluminum, I've watched them severely hurt it. Aluminum is pretty easy to see that they have huge excess capacity, more than the world needs, so that depresses the price everywhere and essentially puts everybody out of business. And they do this by, carrying double books, subsidizing energy costs, paying less wages, lax environmental controls. I'm not a big Trump fan. In fact, I think he's the worst president we've had, at least in my lifetime. When I go back to Nixon, Kennedy, I think Nixon at the moment looks pretty good compared to Trump. But this tribalism of everything he does is wrong and bad, I think is not good for America. So I think it's good every once in a while to say you like something Trump's doing. And I like the fact that he's taken on the Chinese. It may be a little too late, and our current debt structure and this debt load in the United States doesn't help our position in this war very well. That's my dog Bungalow. He's looking for frogs. There's not a lot of young metallurgists and people with expertise in the metals field anymore, and I'll concentrate on metals because that's what I know the most, and even that's a big enough field that there's a lot that I don't know. For instance, they pretty much have a death grip on us on rare earths. If they turn that off, they could shut down our electronics industry. They produce, most of the magnesium, copper, zinc. We're still fairly competitive in some of the steels, and there's a lot of other people. Because steel is cheap, and there's a lot of advantages to produce it locally. But the more exotic the metal, probably in general, the more of a hold on it, with some exceptions like the precious metals. But you can't just turn the supply back on. If you want to make rare earths, you need a deposit somewhere. You need a process to make a concentrate. You need the ability to refine those metals into the individual metals. That process, if you're in a hurry, takes 5 to 8 years to pull that off. Using your cell phone for 8 years, I don't know. That doesn't it's complicated to all of a sudden turn off rare earth supply, for example. And China produces about 80% of the rare earths in the world. Other places can crank up, so maybe they can increase their marginal capacity and double it. Let's give them that benefit. They could do that in a couple of years. But you still have a huge lag between what you need right now and what you can get. So if China wants to play that card, not real clear to me how we counter that. The market will eventually counter it. We'll bring sources online and people will increase capacity, and it'll all work out. But there's a hell of a disruption on the way. So I'm not sure that just the simple act of making a tariff is going to change things. And then if you're going to bring those industries online, it's got to be a sustained program. We have to have the concept of some metals are strategic for our survival, and have programs in place like we used to have the Bureau of Mines, which that probably went out of business before most of you guys came on this planet that are listening to this, all my 3 listeners. So how do you bring an industry back online? You got to start with the education system, and who's going to teach the extractive metallurgy? What schools are going to start up programs? How are you going to staff these plants? It's all takes a long-term view, like the Chinese have. The Chinese plan things out, 20, 50 years in advance. They didn't get into this position of controlling the world's metal supplies just by random chance. They recognized that it's important and maintained a presence, financing people, research over decades. And they stole a lot of technology from U.S. patents, from U.S. companies. First generation, they have companies build plants over there. By the second generation, they've taken the expertise and the jobs in the U.S. have disappeared. And probably by the third generation, or somewhere between the second and third, our expertise disappears. There's not young, ancient Texan metallurgists enough to take over the production of metals in this country. And if you start today, 10 years, you might have some people. I hate to sound obnoxious here, that know, half of what ancient metallurgists like myself and others know. But we're not going to be around, most of us, in 10 years. So there's a huge long-term outlook that needs to be present in America. That isn't. There needs to be a commitment to people and to jobs, and a commitment to staying in the business. We also have not in my backyard, the last smelter in this country was built probably in the 60s. Efforts since then, even with smelters that are extremely clean, like are in Germany, can't be built in the United States. Instead, we let them go to Peru and other places where I worked in one of them in La Arroya that's considered the dirtiest place on the planet, run by a U.S. company, freed from the U.S. regulations, goes overseas and pollutes. It's more complicated than that. They're not all the bad guys. It's not easy to change the world and stay competitive against the Chinese without doing some of that. So we've got this whole multifaceted, complex challenge to think long term in the U.S. Business in America doesn't do that. Things like the Bureau of Mines used to do that. It doesn't anymore because it doesn't even exist. Department of Interior's taken over some of that. Deposits here are also not as good as they used to be. So I applaud Trump in taking on China and the unfair practices that they do that are actually bad for China and the world. But I don't see much chance of long-term success, well, at least in the area I know about metals and minerals, because those projects take time, commitment, and resources. And of course there's a payoff at the end, but it's certainly not something that happens overnight. It's a decade away. And we all kind of live today in a little bit of oblivion to what it takes to sustain our lifestyle. The copper that's in my house over there, the steel that's in my car that's behind that fence, the metal table sitting out there, the barbecue grill, the cast iron bench there, the metal table beside me. We can't see them from here. The electric lines coming into my house, the faucets, all that has a long supply chain. A lot of it originates in China, and there's just not the capacity to replace it over here. Anyway, it's going to be interesting to see it play out, and I wish Trump the best of luck on this move against China. And I would like to see a united country that somehow recognizes that we've got a problem with China and is willing to work with the president to actually figure out how to make this move against China successful. This is the Ancient Texan.